Tonight's show, as mentioned, is going to deal primarily with the earliest connections between fascism and the Catholic Church. And after explaining the other four shows to you, then I'm going to come back and after Dave explains the other four shows to you, I'm going to give you a little bit of more of an overview on that.
Might be even a little more accurate to describe this as we did before, but as the ties between the Vatican and fascism, because while there are some ties of the Catholic Church as a whole, I guess for casual purposes, we might distinguish between the Church and the Vatican the way one might distinguish between the White House and the United States as a whole.
Good point.
Certainly the two are very closely related, and the one has a profound effect on the other, yet the United States as a whole is much larger than the White House, and there are any number of instances where you could cite White House malfeasance which could not be attributed to the country as a whole. What we're going to be talking about is analogous in many ways, because we're going to be talking about some real skullduggery on the part of people very, very high up in the Catholic Church, often for pragmatic reasons, but skullduggery nonetheless. This is in no way intended to reflect on the Church as a whole or any individual Catholic, because it's an important distinction, and the stuff we're going to be talking about, as usual on these broadcasts, is pretty controversial, but again, we'll develop the theme, because part of the difference between the Church and the Vatican as a whole is with that distinction is one of the things that we're going to be taking up at greater length throughout the 5 programs.
Indeed. And I have to second Dave on that. I'm glad he made that point, because, of course, in many cases, now not necessarily as much with this case, because a lot of this stuff is still unfolding even as we go to press, as it were, as we go on the radio on this first day of May 1986. But in many cases, these abuses, or some abuses on the part of certain higher-ups in the Catholic Church, have led to waves of reform throughout the Church. And of course, we're seeing a Church right now that's in many ways is divided against itself in Latin America, in Eastern Europe, in Asia, Africa, all over the world. There are forces for change coming from all different political and spiritual positions, laboring to bring the Church into their own particular version of the 21st century. So again, as Dave said, we're talking almost entirely in this case about happenings at the Vatican, or at the behest of the Vatican, and certain people therein involved. And again, no blanket indictment of the Church is intended whatsoever.
And indeed, one of the things we're going to be pointing out is how often Vatican policies can not only be in direct conflict with those of many other people within the Church, but how specifically that conflict can prove to be unhealthy for some of the people lower down on the ladder. And occasionally even some of the people fairly high up on the ladder, as we'll be looking at in later broadcasts. But again, this is not meant to reflect on the Church as a whole. It is very definitely intended to reflect on the Vatican and on certain realpolitik elements within the Catholic Church, and that's what we're going to be talking about this evening. Looking ahead to the other programs, we're going to begin this evening by talking about fascism in the Vatican, then in what really represents an extension of that discussion, as we will be looking at later in this broadcast and next Thursday as well. After that, we're going to be looking at the first of 2 programs about the Propaganda Due Lodge, the P2 Lodge, basically a crypto-fascist government that had been running Italy for many years, and actually was operating as sort of an international fascist network in many other countries besides Italy. This P2 Lodge was headed and founded by a man named Licio Gelli, who we're going to be talking about this evening. We're going to be talking about the P2 Lodge next week, specifically about the Vatican banking scandals, about the possible murder of Pope John Paul I, and people and things of this kind. The third program, will be the second of 2 programs about the P2 Lodge, about the Propaganda Due Lodge. That will deal with the international aspects of P2, P2 in various Latin American countries, and specifically the involvement of P2 in terrorist incidents, the involvement of P2 with NATO as a whole, with drug smuggling in Latin America, with the Galen organization, specifically people like Klaus Barbie, and things of that kind. The fourth program, we're going to be dealing with an organization called STIBOM, which is an arms for drug smuggling ring very much connected to the shooting of the Pope and to the P2 Lodge. We'll be looking at that in program 4. And in the 5th and final broadcast, we're going to be looking at Western intelligence connections to the shooting of the Pope. So tonight, Fascism in the Vatican, the next 2 shows on the 8th and 15th of May, respectively, also from 7 to midnight, the P2 Lodge, parts 1 and 2. Part 4 is about STIBOM on the 22nd of May from 7 to midnight. And on the 29th, we're going to have the Western intelligence connections to the shooting of the Pope. And also, by the way, coming up this month, for the benefit of people who may be relatively new, on Sunday the 25th from 6 p.m. to midnight, we're going to be doing Uncle Sam and the Swastika about U.S. industrial cooperation with the Third Reich. So that's another program to take note of later. But those are the 5 parts: Fascism in the Vatican tonight, 2 shows about PIUS, Stiebaum, and then Western intelligence connections.
Okay, now, in the broadest sort of overview, there has long been a great degree of sympathy within the Catholic Church, and specifically within the Vatican, of course, for right-wing movements, for the very purpose that they were dramatically and diametrically opposed to left-wing movements. And, of course, in our century, left-wing movements have meant socialism and communism. And specifically, one of the tenets of communism, if not socialism, is the abolition eventually of the reliance of the common people on the church. And of course, usually when the church is spoken of, the primary villain, as far as the communists are concerned, has been the Catholic Church, because of course it is the longest lasting, it is the largest, it is the most wealthy, and throughout history it has had the largest influence by far on Europe, which of course is basically the birthplace of the communist idea. Now, again, for those of you who do not know Dave or I just want to hasten to explain that neither Dave nor I have any particular political point of view, and certainly no party point of view. Neither of us are at all inclined towards socialism or communism, and neither are we hope, knee-jerk attackers of organized religion or conservative politics or anything of that sort. But we are going to be making some strong statements, we think backed up, whenever we're making them, we think backed up by fact. And we are making these only in the interest of trying to get to an understanding of certain issues. So, again, just to state that that we're not representing anybody's viewpoint except our own.
In other words, basically, this is investigative journalism or investigative research. We're not looking to grind an ideological axe.
Right, exactly. Now, okay, but all those facts being understood, the fact remains is that the Church has long felt that its largest enemy in the real world, in the temporal world, is communism, potential and actual. And the Church has always felt a strong desire to see communism stamped out, and especially, of course, since the turn of the century and since the success of the Communist Revolution originally in Russia. And because of this, the Church has found itself in some rather strange positions, and we're going to be looking at that. But unfortunately, it's not only that they've wound up in some strange positions by proximity, but that in many cases, and specifically in the case of a man who eventually was to become Pope Pius XII tonight, it wasn't only through pragmatism, but one might almost believe through a fairly sincere sharing of some of the ideals of fascism that these people wound up in this position.
Another remark that should be made here, perhaps by way of introduction, is that again, we're not passing judgment one way or the other on the efficacy or the value of the Church's stand with regard to socialism and or Marxism. What we're looking at here is how the realpolitik, which the Vatican has been led into because of that stand, wound up corrupting the living daylights out of the Vatican itself. In other words, what we're looking at here is a process of political corruption, not only of the Vatican, but because of the Vatican's power, and the world's population is 25% Catholic. Because of that, a large portion of human behavior. So that it's a process of Vatican corruption that we're looking at here, stemming from that ideological stance and some of the things they have done in order to fulfill that.
Okay, now we're going to start the information section of our broadcast tonight in Germany immediately after World War I, in the political ferment that was Germany. And of course, it would take a long time to explain everything that was going on in Germany in 1919. The war had ended. The Kaiser had fled into exile in Holland. The ruling class of the country, the Hohenzollern Empire, was in disrepute. The various landmarks or monuments of the culture, the Church among them, were in some danger and in disrepute because of the fact that it was in fact the old Hohenzollern Empire that had come to an end more or less with the failure of Germany after a very aggressive, successful start to win World War I. The only people who were not in disrepute at the time really was the military. The officers, some of them were, but the rank-and-file military men were thought to have given great sacrifice for very little reward. So again, we're looking at a country that is shifting rapidly back and forth in swings from the left to the right.
Well, specifically a country that for at least for a certain period immediately following the First World War was in a state of armed revolution. There was an abortive socialist revolution largely grouped around doctrinaire communist elements. we looked at this and at the response of the Ebert government, the first of the Weimar governments, in Radio Free America show number 10. I think people wanting to get some background against what we're talking about right here would do very well to secure our archive show, Radio Free America number 10, where we specifically look at the origins of the Nazi Party and how they grew out of the so-called Freikorps or Free Corps, underground German military units put together in order to put down the German Revolution. Again, Radio Free America number 10, the first of our Aryan Nations series, available from DAVCorp.
Now, again, at this same time, one Adolf Hitler, who had been formerly a corporal, who had been involved himself in essentially turning informer, and was responsible for the destruction of one part of the socialist revolution, quote unquote, in the Munich area. Hitler himself was steadily moving toward power with the support of large elements of the general staff, the German general staff, that was determined to gain its power back despite the fact that its Prussian Junker leaders, which is of course the hereditary nobility of Eastern Germany, the Prussian Junkers were in a bit of disrepute at that point, but the hardline military men were going to get back into power, and the way they were going to do it was basically to exploit the turmoil in the streets, the fear and uncertainty of the populace.
So again, at the point at which we're going to be picking up the story of Hitler, Adolf Hitler, well, Germany is in a state of armed conflict, basically. There's an abortive revolution and a resulting reaction in which much of the military was simply returned back into power, albeit perhaps in an even more advantageous position because they were largely underground. And Adolf Hitler at this point is actually an underground agent for the Reichswehr, for the political department of the German army.
Now, we're going to read this section from a book called La Popessa, and it's by Paul I. Murphy with R. Renee Arlington, copyrighted 1983 by Warner Books. It was there in Munich in 1919, amid the war's resulting impoverishment and unrest, that Hitler's nationalism was born. From then on, Bavaria was destined, in the years ahead, to become a nest and breeding ground for the Führer and his growing legion of malcontents. And so, in this state of ferment and desperation, nowhere more erosive than in Munich, Hitler came one night to the holy residence of Archbishop Eugenio Pacelli. And his last name is spelled Pacelli, and Eugenio Pacelli is a very important man. All others in the household were asleep by then except Pascalina. Pascalina is the La Popessa alluded to in the title.
She was a Bavarian nun named Sister Pascalina Lehnert, Lehnert, who became a very, very close friend and, above all, and more importantly, perhaps, confidant of Cardinal Eugenio, at this point Archbishop, later Cardinal, and finally, Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, and eventually he became Pope Pius XII, but that's later in our story.
That's right, and she was such a close confidant that by the time he became Pope, she was known as La Popessa. Okay. Hitler came one night to the holy residence of Archbishop Eugenio Pacelli. All others in the household were asleep by then except Pascalina. The nun proceeded to let Hitler in and escorted him to the sitting room to await the Archbishop. She had never seen Hitler before or even heard about him. Neither had Pacelli. The caller bore a letter of introduction from General Ludendorff, extolling him for acts of bravery while serving as a corporal under Ludendorff's command. Hitler told Pacelli that he was out to check the spread of atheistic communism in Munich and elsewhere. Through the door, which had been left ajar, Pascalina overheard the prelate say, quote, "Munich has been good to me. So has Germany. I pray Almighty God that this land remain a holy land, in the hands of our Lord, and free of communism." Pascalina knew that Pacelli lived in fear of atheistic communism because of its professed aim to annihilate Catholicism. For that reason, and despite the Church's historical claim of strict neutrality, the prelate had made his goal the complete destruction of this, quote, "insidious new threat to world freedom and brotherly love," unquote. Okay, now, before I read the last bit, I want to go back over this again because this is very important. Now, this is not an actual document where Pius has gone on, the soon-to-be Pius XII has gone on paper and said this, but this is the reminiscences of Pascalina, the woman who probably knew this man best, that the author's relating here. And it says, for that reason, and despite the Church's historical claim of strict neutrality, the prelate had made his goal the complete destruction of, quote, "this insidious new threat to world freedom and brotherly love," unquote. Now, when you remember that Pius XII's goal was to destroy communism in the world, it brings some of his actions as as Pope later on into a clearer light. Going along. It did not come as a surprise to her, therefore, in light of Pacelli's hatred of the Reds, to see the prelate present Hitler with a large cache of church money to aid the rising revolutionary and his small, struggling band of anti-communists. Quote, "Go, quell the devil's works," Pacelli told Hitler. "Help spread the love of Almighty God." "For the love of Almighty God," she heard the young man reply.
Well, obviously, the brutal irony here of then Archbishop, eventually Cardinal, and finally Pope Pius XII, Cardinal Pacelli, Archbishop Pacelli, Cardinal Pacelli, and Pius XII, to be talking to Adolf Hitler and admonishing him, or exhorting him rather, to go quell the devil's works in the name of Almighty God. Obviously, the facts of the matter have been that pretty much Hitler immersed himself in those very same works, at least as far as we've been able to determine. So remember here that the papal nuncio to Munich, then Archbishop Eugenio Pacelli, who eventually goes on to become Pope Pius XII, has been placing church money in Adolf Hitler's hands so that he could fight communism in 1919. Hitler himself was not to become head of state for another 14 years, but the church, or the Vatican we should say, through Archbishop Pacelli, in bed with Hitler in 1919. Now in Italy, where Mussolini, who was the first fascist, had come to power in 1922, it should be noted that there was a lot of friction between the church and Mussolini, and this was resolved, to make a long story short here, for both parties by basically a treaty of mutual interest. This treaty is called the Lateran Treaty. It was signed in 1929. We're going to talk about this right now. The church, basically both Italy and the church, benefited tremendously. Both gained power by basically, that is, the Mussolini government and the Vatican gained power basically by, instead of being at loggerheads, they combined forces, and both benefited tremendously. Returning again to La Popessa by Paul Murphy. Now, we're going to be talking here about the formation, or rather Murphy's going to be writing here about the formation of the Lateran Treaty. Now, the Lateran Treaty made the Catholicism the state religion of Italy. It placed a great deal of money in the hands of the Vatican, which we're going to talk about. It made religious instruction, Catholic religious instruction, mandatory in all public schools in Italy. It placed marriage under the institution of the church, made divorce illegal, and it also, for Mussolini's standpoint, gave the stamp of church approval to his government and the resulting excesses that government engaged in. Now, perhaps for our purposes here, the two most important things to note are one of the key people involved in setting up this deal is a fellow named Francesco Pacelli. Now, Eugenio Pacelli, who was the Archbishop and the papal nuncio to Munich, who was placing the money in Hitler's hand in 1919, Francesco Pacelli, who is a lawyer, very much involved in setting up the Lateran Treaty between the Vatican and the Mussolini government. Francesco is Pacelli's brother. We're going to take a look at other members of the Pacelli family here in just a second, but again, the brother of the man who was putting church money in Hitler's hand in 1919 and who was to go on and become the Pope and cooperate with the Nazis and fascists in a variety of ways that we're going to examine, his brother played a key role in setting up the actual treaty between the Mussolini government and the Vatican. Returning again to Paul Murphy's La Popessa. Subtle maneuverings by the way, the both sides here referred to are the Vatican and the Mussolini government. Subtle maneuverings by both sides for a peace treaty had begun in mid-January, with Mussolini casting feelers and the Pope taking the bait. The pontiff forthwith appointed Pacelli's brother, Francesco, in the Vatican's view as clever and devoted a lawyer as Eugenio Pacelli was a churchman, to spearhead the responsibility. Francesco was commissioned first to meet with Mussolini, then to head up a team to play the church's best hand. Francesco, in selecting his choice players, thought first of his extraordinarily capable brother, Eugenio, who was delighted to serve. Eugenio, in turn, long convinced that Pasqualino was his able and most trusted aide, quite naturally looked to the loyal nun as his right arm in this, the very sort of mission Pacelli knew could one day make him Secretary of State. That's Secretary of State of the Vatican, by the way, which he eventually achieved. Always out of the limelight, Pasqualini sat with Pacelli for hours, day after day, listening to ideas he would try out on her, contributing her own thoughts, passing much information along on long-distance phone to his brother Francesco during those times when Pacelli himself was off on other affairs of the church. It was one of the most exciting times of my life, she said more than half a century later, her eyes glittering as if it were all yesterday. The church's demands upon Mussolini were great. The Vatican wanted no more attacks by the dictator or by anyone in his government. It wanted Catholicism to be recognized as Italy's official religion. It wanted all marriages to be performed by the church and divorce outlawed. It wanted tax exemptions on all church property and certain added privileges for its palaces, basilicas, and apostolic institutes. It wanted mandatory religious instruction taught by church-appointed leaders in all of Italy's public schools. Most of all, the Vatican wanted to be recognized as a sovereign state with recognition of the Pope as its sovereign head. And the Vatican wanted money, the equivalent of almost $100 million in American currency, ostensibly as compensation for church property seized by the Italian state in 1870. I would interrupt here. $100 million in this period of time in the 1920s, it was much, much more than $100 million is today. Was worth much more. The church had been extremely careful not to let on to Mussolini or to any outsider that its very survival now depended upon the fascist funds. All Mussolini appeared to want in return for his signature was the Pope's goodwill and to live in peace with the Vatican. The dictator tied his sudden about-face to a philanthropic dream, a plan he had that supposedly would draw millions of travelers to Rome each year by promoting the Eternal City as the center of the Catholic world, a mecca of peace and love and holiness. In Mussolini's view, the Vatican and Rome would flourish in untold wealth with such a cooperative arrangement. In the final analysis, like men who run government and business, perhaps like people as a whole, the clergymen of the Vatican were prepared to hear only what sounded most appealing to their ears and to themselves. And so the day came when the Church of Rome created a spectacular extravaganza of pomp and circumstance to herald to the world its triumphant victory, its pact with Mussolini and the Italian state. For the first time in history, the Holy Roman Catholic Church was now an independent and sovereign state to be known as the State of Vatican City, which the Pope recognized as its undisputed ruler. Catholicism was now Italy's official religion, and the fascist state would underwrite parochial schools. Italian Jewry loudly protested the deliberate exclusion of funds for Jewish education, one spokesman calling the church fascist deal a moral pogrom, unquote. Incredibly, every important demand put by the church to Mussolini and the fascists apparently had been accepted. To celebrate the signing, a great ceremony of color and pageantry was held in the Vatican's historic Lateran Palace on February 11th, 1929, 3 years from the start of negotiations. The Lateran Treaty, named for the palace where it was signed, was heralded by the Vatican as the most important event in modern church history. Cardinal Secretary of State Gaspari, in the church's most impressive robes, placed hand and seal to the treaty in behalf of His Holiness. Benito Mussolini, heels clicking, bedecked with medals and dressed in the full military style and splendor of his fascist dictatorship, then signed with a flourish and a smile on behalf of the Kingdom of Italy. The Vatican would now have its own currency, its own police force, its own citizenship, a small armed force, and its own flag of yellow and white. The Pope and the Catholic world were euphoric. So, again, the brother of Eugenio Pacelli, Francesco Pacelli, is a lawyer, a layman, who is a key figure in negotiating a treaty between Mussolini's fascist government and the Vatican to make Catholicism Italy's official state religion. One of the key people involved in setting this up on behalf of the Vatican was Archbishop Eugenio Pacelli, the same archbishop who was papal nuncio to Munich, was giving church money to Hitler in 1919. And perhaps most importantly, for the purposes of the five-part broadcast here, the Lateran Treaty, in addition to making the Catholicism Italy's state religion, placed a great deal of working capital into the hands of the Vatican.
And not only that, but it freed up ultimately what the Vatican could do with that working capital. In the Vatican, the Catholic Church became no longer just a hoarding entity or a saving entity, but it became a spending and manipulating and speculating entity, which will lead us eventually directly into the problems that result in the shooting of Pope John Paul II.
By the way, interested listeners who would like to pursue this material at greater length than they're able to with the broadcast we're going to be presenting on this, it should be noted that both the book La Popessa, which we've just been talking about, and the book that we're about to get into, In God's Name, are available right now in paperback. These are current paperback books, so there's never been a better time to actually start getting into this for those who would like to do so.
Absolutely. And as we go on farther to explore the Vatican's role in the world of international finance, or at least the beginnings of it, we're going to read some from a book called In God's Name, subtitled An Investigation into the Murder of Pope John Paul I. And the book is by David A. Yallop, Y-A-L-L-O-P, copyrighted 1984 by Bantam Books. Okay, Yallop is again talking about Well, it's self-evident. I'll just read. The modern wealth of the Vatican is based on the generosity of Benito Mussolini. The Lateran Treaty, which his government concluded with the Vatican in 1929, gave the Roman Catholic Church a variety of guarantees and measures of protection. The Holy See obtained recognition of itself as a sovereign state. It was exempted from paying taxes both for its properties and its citizens, exempted from paying duty on imported goods. It had diplomatic immunity and accompanying privileges for its own diplomats and those accredited to it by foreign powers. Mussolini guaranteed the introduction of Catholic religious teaching in all public high schools in Italy, and the entire institution of marriage was placed under canon law. That's C-A-N-O-N, by the way, which ruled out divorce. The benefits for the Vatican were many, not least the fiscal ones. In other words, it's religious law, not a shotgun marriage. Article 1, this is one of the articles from the Lateran Treaty. Article 1, Italy undertakes to pay the Holy See on the ratification of the treaty the sum of 750 million lira, and to hand over at the same time consolidated 5% state bonds to the bearer for the nominal value of 1 billion lira. Of course, Italy in this sense is the Mussolini government. Yallop writes, at the 1929 rate of exchange, this package represented $81 million. A 1984 equivalent figure is approximately 500 million. Vatican Incorporated was in business. It has never looked back. To handle the windfall, Pope Pius XI created on June 7, 1929, the Special Administration. Appointed to run it was a layman, Bernardino Nogara. Apart from having many millions of dollars to work with, Nogara had another very important asset. 100 years earlier, the Roman Catholic Church had completely reversed its position on money lending. Indeed, the Church can rightfully claim to have changed the meaning of the word usury. In the classic sense, usury means all gains from money lending. For over 1,800 years, the Roman Catholic Church had dogmatically stated that the charging of any interest on a loan was absolutely forbidden, as being contrary to divine law. The prohibition was restated in various church councils: Arles, Nicaea, Carthage, the Lateran. At this council, the last one, the Lateran in 1139, usurers were condemned to excommunication. So, although the laws of many states made the practice legal, it was still heresy. And before I go on with this, let me just mention something, a little historical note that a lot of you may not realize. Since we're talking about fascism, and since we're talking about Nazism, and of course one of the main forms of hatred that sprung out of Nazism was the rampant anti-Semitism. Much of European anti-Semitism started because of the Catholic Church's ban on money lending, on usury, of charging interest for loans, because obviously good Catholics who did not want to break that law were not going to loan their money out for free and risk it. So much of the money lending in medieval Europe fell to the Jews, and because of that, and because of the fact that the Jews were charging the interest on the loans, but they were necessary because that's the only way money could be loaned, the Jews came in for a great deal of hatred, and when every now and then they had to collect on a loan that was not paid back, they were scapegoated as being the source of all evil in Europe. And for a large reason, that's why the conditions were there that the fascists were later able to exploit in this century. Anyway, going on. So although the laws of many states made the practice legal, it was still heresy. That is, until 1830, when the Church reversed its position. Thus, by courtesy of the Roman Catholic Church, usury now means lending money at exorbitant rates of interest. Self-interest produced a total reversal on the Church's teaching with regard to money lending. Perhaps if celibacy was no longer the rule for priests, it might move the Roman Catholic Church's teaching on artificial birth control, Yallop suggests. Bernardino Nogara was a member of a devout Roman Catholic family. Many of its members made, in a variety of ways, significant contributions to the Church. 3 of his brothers became priests. Another became director of the Vatican Museum. But Bernardino Nogara's contribution was, by any standard, the most profound. Born in Belano, near Lake Como, in 1870, he achieved early success as a mineralogist, working in Turkey. In October 1912, he played a leading role in the peace treaty of Auchy between Italy and Turkey. In 1919, he was a member of the Italian delegation that negotiated the peace treaty between Italy, France, Britain, and Germany. He subsequently worked on behalf of the Italian government as a delegate to the Banco Commerciale in Istanbul. when Pope Pius XI was seeking a man capable of administering the fruits of the Lateran Treaty, his close friend and confidant, Monsignor Nogara, suggested his brother Bernardino. With that selection, Pius XI struck pure gold. Nogara was reluctant to accept the job, and did so only when Pope Pius XI agreed to certain conditions. Nogara did not wish to be trammeled by any traditional views the Church might still hold about making money. The ground rules Nogara insisted on included the following. 1. His decisions on what investments to make would be totally and completely free of any religious or doctrinal considerations. 2. He would be free to invest Vatican funds anywhere in the world. The Pope agreed and opened the doors to currency speculation and to playing the market in stock exchanges, including the buying of shares in companies whose products were inconsistent with Roman Catholic teaching. Items such as bombs, tanks, guns, and contraceptives might be condemned in the pulpit, but the shares Nogara bought for the Vatican in companies that manufactured these items helped to fill the coffers in St. Peter's. Nogara played the gold market and the futures market. He bought Italgas, sole supplier of gas in many of Italy's cities, placing on the board, on behalf of the Vatican, Francesco Pacelli. Pacelli's brother became in time the next pope, Pius XII. Again, that's Eugenio Pacelli, as Dave already mentioned. And the nepotism that stemmed from that papacy was manifest throughout Italy. If there was a Pacelli on the board, 6-4, the company belonged to the Vatican. Among the banks that came under Vatican influence or control through Nogara's purchases were Banco di Roma, Banco di Santo Spirito, and Cassa di Risparmio di Roma. The man clearly not only had a way with money, but was also fairly gifted in the art of persuasion. When Banco di Roma was floundering and threatening to take with it a large amount of Vatican money, Nogara persuaded Mussolini to take over the bank's largely worthless securities and transfer them to a government holding company. And transfer them to a government holding company, the Institute for Industrial Reconstruction, IRI. Mussolini also agreed that the Vatican should be reimbursed, not at the current market value of the securities, which was virtually nil, but at their original purchase price. IRI paid Banco di Roma over $630 million. The loss was written off by the Italian Treasury, which is another way of saying the ordinary people picked up the bill, just as they had been doing for the clerics since the Middle Ages. Much of the speculation Nogara indulged in on behalf of the Vatican certainly contravened canon law, and probably civil law, but as his client was the Pope, who was not asking questions, Nogara remained untroubled by such niceties. Using Vatican capital, Nogara acquired significant and often controlling shares in company after company. Having acquired a company, he rarely sat on the board, preferring to nominate one of the trusted Vatican elite to look after the Church's interests. The three nephews of Pius XII, Princes Carlo, Marcantonio, and Giulio Pacelli, were three of the inner elite whose names began to appear as directors on an ever-growing list of companies. These were the men's uomini di fiducia, men of trust. Textiles, telephone communications, railways, cement, electricity, water. Bernardino Nogara was everywhere. When Mussolini needed armaments for his invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, a substantial proportion was supplied by a munitions plant Nogara had acquired on behalf of the Vatican. Realizing, before many, the inevitability of the Second World War, Nogara moved part of the assets then at his disposal into gold. He bought from the United States $26.8 million worth of gold at $35 an ounce. Later, he sold about 20% of it on the open market at a profit so substantial that the original purchases were covered in their entirety. His speculations in gold continued throughout his time at the head of Vatican Incorporated. Between 1945 and 1951, he purchased more than 450,000 ounces. During the following 2 years, he sold more than 70,000 ounces. My research indicates that nearly 500,000 ounces are on deposit at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. This single holding of the Vatican, purchased originally for less than $20 million, is now worth some $200 million.
Okay, so basically, as a result of the capital placed into the Vatican's hands by the Lateran Treaty, again negotiated not only by Eugenio Pacelli on behalf of the Church, but also his brother Francesco, a layman who was helping to set up a liaison with the Mussolini government, this places a whole lot of capital into the Church's hands, into the Vatican's hands. A man named Bernardino Nogara manages this capital and proceeds to invest it in a lot of very lucrative investments. It's worth noting that a lot of the industrial and financial enterprises in which the Vatican wound up investing wound up with a Pacelli, either Francesco or one of his brothers, on the board of directors. So the Pacelli family here is front and center and absolutely inextricable from the formation of the liaison between not only the Hitler government but also the Mussolini government and the Vatican. Recall that, again, Eugenio Pacelli placing money in Hitler's hand in 1919, Francesco helping to swing the Lateran Treaty along with Eugenio, and then many of the Pacellis, including Francesco, winding up on as members of the board of directors of Vatican-related businesses. Now, an event we're going to skip ahead a little in time, going to 1942. Then we're going to go back a little bit and cover some events during the 1930s, but in connection with the Vatican finances. And recall that the Vatican, as a significant financial entity, was really boosted for all intents and purposes in the modern world by the Lateran Treaty. In 1942, specifically on June 27th, an institution was created here called the Institute for Religious Works, or IOR. That basically is the Vatican Bank. This was created by then Pope Pius XII in conjunction with Bernardino Nogara. Recall that Pius XII used to be Archbishop and then Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli. Now, the Vatican Bank is going to be front and center in the next two, it's going to figure throughout the course of our entire series, but in particular, the next broadcast is going to deal specifically with a number of different scandals involving the Vatican Bank, the IOR, the Institute for Religious Works. What we're looking at here is the origins of the Institute for Religious Works growing out of the huge financial nest egg which accrues to the Vatican as a result of the Lateran Treaty of 1929. David Yallop describes that in God's Name. He writes as follows. On June 27th, 1942, Pope Pius XII decided to bring another part of the Vatican into the modern world and into the ambit of Bernardino Nogara. He changed the name of the Administration of Religious Works to the Institute for Religious Works. The change did not capture the front pages of the world's newspapers, but by that act, the IOR, or the Vatican Bank as it is known by all but the Vatican, was born. Vatican Incorporated had sired a bastard child. The original function of the administration, set up by Pope Leo XIII in 1887, had been to gather and administer funds for religious works. It was in no sense a bank. Under Pius, its function became, quote, the custody and administration of monies in bonds and cash, and properties transferred or entrusted to the Institute itself by fiscal or legal purposes for the purposes of religious works and works of Christian piety, unquote. It was and is in every sense a bank. Nogara took to reading the terms of the Lateran Treaty very closely, particularly clauses 29, 30, and 31. These dealt with tax exemptions and the formation of new, tax-exempt ecclesiastical corporations, unquote, over which the Italian state would have no control. Reading that last sentence again, the Vatican clauses 29, 30, and 31, quote, these dealt with tax exemptions and the formation of new, tax-exempt ecclesiastical corporations over which the Italian state would have no control. Interesting discussions began about the meaning of the phrase ecclesiastical corporations. Doubtless distracted by other events of the time, Mussolini took a liberal view. In 1942, the finance ministry of the Italian government issued a circular stating that the Holy See was exempt from paying the tax on stock dividends. It was signed by the Director General of the ministry, whose name, quite appropriately, was Buon Cristiano, which translates good Christian. The circular specified the various organizations within the Holy See that were exempt from the tax. The list was long and included the special administration and the Vatican Bank. The man whom Nogara selected to control the Vatican Bank was Father, later Cardinal, Alberto Di Giorgio. Already functioning as Nogara's assistant in the special administration, he kept a foot in both sections by retaining that position and assuming the role of first secretary, then president of the Vatican Bank. Apart from the controlling interests in many banks that Nogara acquired outside the Vatican walls, he now had two in-house banks to work with. So again, as a result of the Vatican financial gains, as a result of the Lateran Treaty of 29, Pope Pius XII, who as Archbishop Eugenio Pacelli had helped negotiate that along with his brother Francesco, changes the function and title of the Administration of Religious Works. It becomes the Institute for Religious Works, and instead of simply being a an administration to distribute funds becomes a money-making institution which can not only invest money at a profit, but then, according to a ruling by the Mussolini government, would their profits, all the money earned from the sale of dividends, was tax-exempt. That's an important thing to remember. Here, again, in 1942, stemming out of the profits the Vatican got out of the Lateran Treaty is the beginning of the Vatican Bank, and that is going to be front and center throughout our 5-part series.
Indeed. Now, skipping back to 1933, still reading from David Yallop's In God's Name. In 1933, Vatican Incorporated again demonstrated its ability to negotiate successfully with fascist governments. The Concordat of 1929 with Mussolini, that's of course the Lateran Treaty, was followed with a Concordat between the Holy See and Hitler's Third Reich. Solicitor Francesco Pacelli had been one of the key figures in the Mussolini agreement. His brother, Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, the future Pius XII, had a leading role negotiating as the Vatican Secretary of State in concluding a treaty with Nazi Germany. Hitler saw many potential benefits in the treaty, not least the fact that Pacelli, a man already displaying marked pro-Nazi attitudes, might prove a useful ally in the approaching World War. History was to prove that Hitler's assessment was accurate. Despite a great deal of world pressure, Pope Pius XII declined to excommunicate either Hitler or Mussolini. Perhaps his refusal was based on an awareness of just how politically irrelevant he was. His was a papacy that affected neutrality, which talked to the German episcopate about, quote, just wars, and did precisely the same with the French bishops. This resulted in the French bishops supporting France and the German bishops supporting Germany. His was a papacy that declined to condemn the Nazi invasion of Poland because, he said, quote, we cannot forget that there are 40 million Catholics in the Reich. What would they be exposed to after such an act by the Holy See, unquote. For the Vatican, one of the major advantages to emerge from the very lucrative deal with Hitler was confirmation of the Kirchensteuer, church tax. This is a state tax that is still deducted at source from all wage earners in Germany. One can opt out by renouncing one's religion. In practice, few choose to. This tax represents between 8 and 10% on income tax collected by the German government. The money is handed over to the Protestant and Catholic churches. Substantial amounts derived from the Kirchensteuer began to flow to the Vatican in the years immediately preceding the Second World War. The flow continued throughout that war, $100 million in 1943, for example. In the Vatican, Nogara put the German revenue to work alongside the other currencies that were pouring in. Now, we would hate to suggest that it was purely and simply greed, but the only other alternative to greed is perhaps, well, I suppose at the best you could suggest that there was some kind of well-meaning motive on the part of Eugenio Pacelli and the others in terms of trying to create a more peaceful world by finding a way to get along with governments like Hitler's and Mussolini's. However, as we've seen at the very beginning and also from Mark's remarks made later on, Pacelli did seem to in fact have a real affinity with the fascists, and in fact felt that their goal of destroying Bolshevism was pretty damn close to a holy cause. So to suggest anything other than fairly cynical motives on the part of the Vatican at this point in time, and specifically Secretary of State Eugenio Pacelli, soon to be Pope Pius XII, would be perhaps carrying innocence and naivete a little bit too far.